Welcome to another watercolor tutorial by me, Tim Wilmot. Thanks for watching. This is Sidmouth in Devon, UK, and these lovely red rocks, I think they're called mudstone, is their geological name, but very interesting rock formations along this part of the coast with lots of horizontal strata and striations, creating little sort of gaps and fissures and protrusions on the rock face. But it's a nice scene to attempt the receding edge of these cliffs going into the distance. You can see the cloud. There's sort of like a low cloud coming over the scene. This is a photograph taken by me. It was actually in summer, but it was it was quite a lovely day. It was quite a nice day from a point of view of weather, but we've got some low cloud sea mist coming in, which is creating some soft edges to the tops of the hills and the coast going into the distance. But a nice scene to paint. Maybe quite challenging from the point of view, if you've seen any of my videos before, I love painting a great range of values, lots of lights and darks. Whereas with this, we don't have many darks to play with. Yeah, but we've got some on the cliff face, some of the edges of the protrusions and these dark vertical fissures and cracks in the rock. So we can play around with those, trying to create a nice texture of trying to pay homage to the rock face there. But I certainly want to try and, from a watercolor point of view, try and get that receding cliff going into the distance, going quite soft into the distance, and the softer edges like that there, for example. The soft edge right at the top there as well, and mixing that with hard edges, lots of hard edges in the cliff face and on this slipway on this harbour wall. I'll also be painting a couple of boats and, of course, a figure. Figures are always great to include in a watercolour, to add some extra interest, some focal point to it, some idea of scale of the scene as well. So a number of different watercolor techniques I'll be using along the way. A complete step-by-step demo. I'll go through the whole process with you, starting with the drawing, going through the wash, then with shadows, the darks, some tonal values, painting in the boats. I'll give you my take on how I paint boats that are up on the shore there. Hope you like it, and the first step will be the drawing. The paper I'm using is Saunders Waterford. This is cold press paper, the paper I normally use, the normal texture. So this is medium rough, not ultra smooth, not ultra rough in the middle, and it's 140 pounds in weight, so it will buckle a little bit when I start painting, which I don't mind too much, as the paper will dry flat and it can introduce some nice little sort of curvy marks with the brush as if you do horizontal lines. So first step, the drawing, then getting in the main shapes of the cliff tops, the base of the cliff and the slipway. And then on the slipway, I'm going to be painting a couple of boats, one behind the other, so we're painting a side profile, just a very simple shape of a small boat and then one boat behind it. So a gentle sort of curve along the top of the boat, getting in the keel right, the bow of the boat, and now a figure. Against the railings on the side of the slipway, very simple figure. I find the quicker I do a figure, the looser it's going to be and the fresher it will appear, rather than concentrating on the legs and the arms. So trying to keep it nice and loose. Back to the cliffs, which is of course the main feature, trying to get this receding, the receding of the cliffs into the distance along the Devon coast as we're looking east up the English Channel, and we have that gentle slope from top left to bottom right, and then draw in just the major of vertical striations and the horizontal strata, which I may just put a little bit more detail on, elaborate more on when I get to the painting stage. But that's just really some major lines that I'm picking out there. There's the shadow of the figure. Now, foreground, I've got this angling in from bottom left to top right, which is sort of reflecting the top edge of the cliff. I'm using a 3B pencil here just to get in some quite dark lines, just major lines. Now, don't mind if those lines show through in the end painting. I think it adds a little bit of a charm to the painting, a bit of freshness to it, so I don't mind too much those lines showing through. So first step, getting in the main shapes, not too much detail. Trying to think also about where the main darks will be. Well, there are not many darks in this. It's quite a sort of monotonal. It's almost one tone apart from the receding into the distance, which will allow me, when I come to the painting stage, I'll be able to go lighter in value. So once I'm happy with the drawing, I can then start painting, which will be laying down an initial wash. I'm using a mop brush here. This is a synthetic Raphael mop brush, and mixing up my sky wash. Starting with the top left corner, now I'm coming over slightly the top of the cliffs, just a little bit. Now my brush marks here, I'm sort of coming in at different angles with these brush strokes. I could have laid down horizontal lines of the wash and then just let the bead come down, but I find sometimes with a small amount of sky here, doing these sort of diagonal marks and then coming a little bit lighter towards the horizon, I can introduce some subtle variations in tone, which could just give the impression of a few light clouds, just a little bit of an interest in the sky, rather than it being too flat a wash. Now the sea and the sea is almost the same value as the sky, but coming over towards the left, of course, I've got the reflection of these red cliffs, so I need to adjust that mixture a little bit just to introduce a bit of red to that. I should go over my palette here, the colours I've got. So running from the top, I've got neutral tint, then burnt umber, burnt sienna, yellow ochre there, little blob with a bit of a glistening on it, viridian green, cobalt green, cerulean blue, cobalt blue in the middle, ultramarine blue, alizarin crimson, Windsor red, which I'm mixing there with a bit of light red, the one below that. So I need to get quite rich with this red. And of course it will dry a little bit lighter on the paper. So I need to be thinking about that and maybe go a little bit stronger than I think, just to compensate for the lightness of the dried paint. I'm using a smaller natural squirrel mop brush now, but like the sky, just introducing some variations in brush marks, brush directions, and the consistency of the paint there. The last two colours on the right hand side are cadmium orange and lemon yellow. Then right down towards the bottom in the middle is a lavender, which I sometimes use to create a nice colour of a sky, or mixed with burnt sienna. That makes for quite a nice colour for distant hills, I find. These cliffs then will be quite red, brighter, richer on the left-hand side, which is nearest to us. And then as we go into the distance, go a little bit paler, a little bit bluer, just to give the impression of the distance and the just a little bit of a sea mist coming in over the tops of the hills. Doesn't matter if I don't cover up all of the cliff face, if I leave little white bits showing, that they can always be made into some bit of the rock protruding out and catching a little bit of the light. And the actual rock face has got so many different shades of red and browns and light, almost like lighter cream colours in it. Just test how damp that is with my hand. So going to the edge of this initial row, there are a bit of lavender there, mixed with a bit of cerulean blue. And a little bit of a hard edge at the end of this cliff. Trying to create a sort of jagged edge there, not too perfect. Down to the bottom, down to where the beach starts at the top. Again, just little variations in the combination of reds and blues. And with this mop brush, I can, getting a flat edge to it, getting a straight edge to it, I can be a little bit more precise with those horizontal marks. So quite dark down in the bottom right corner. So that's a little bit of the cliff going into the distance. There's a sort of higher bit to the hill there in the cliff, and it's just going into the going into the clouds, that low cloud a little bit. So try and get a quite a sort of soft edge to that. Now the slipway, it's a warm colour, and just mixed a bit of yellow ochre, bit of the red, not have it too uniform in colour and tone, and dragging the brush we get these little white marks appearing, which I'll leave some of them just to show that there's a little bit of a tiny bit of a rough surface there, little chippings being exposed. And now the vertical face that's facing towards us. And then just below that vertical face, there's a pebbly beach. Now, I'm not going to be painting every single pebble on the beach, but I just want to give the impression of a rough surface there, a different sort of surface to the slipway. So again, a few little white marks. When I drag my brush quite quickly using the side of the brush, you just very often have these little white marks showing, which can be made into, well, little pebbles that are just catching the light. Now for the green top of the hill. There's different bits of shrubs and grass meeting the edge of the cliff. I'm painting with a fairly vivid green first of all, and then try and, like with the cliffs, try and, as we go into the distance, make that green a little bit weaker, a little bit bluer. And then below that, this green ridge, there would be a tiny bit of shadow. The light, because these cliffs are facing, I think they're pretty much facing south, so the sun coming from the right-hand side, shadows will be running off to the left, and we'll have a little bit of shadow underneath the overhang of this vegetation, which will just help us give the impression of the form. So my green It could be any blue really. I don't have any preference for whether it's ultramarine blue or cobalt blue, but then mixed with any yellow, and you create some interesting greens. You could also use the cobalt green and yellow ochre on my palette. That creates a nice, not too vivid a green, quite a nice natural looking green. I'm going for more of a vivid green here, which I think is a nice cool contrast with the warmth of the cliff face. Some of this vegetation is just creeping down the cliff face from the top. I need to dry the paper now. Need to make sure it's completely dry before I go on to the next stage, which will be the furthest cliffs in the distance, and then adding in some darker values into the cliff face just to create the more of a sort of three-dimensional form of the cliff face, and those horizontal strata and the vertical striations, creating that the form of that cliff face. But first of all, I need to dry it, so I've got my silent hairdryer out here. I've muted the sound of the hairdryer, so making sure everything is really dry. Those of you familiar with watercolor will be very aware of certain situations where you do want to paint into a damp surface, and other times you need it to be 100% dry. Just dry the foreground as well. Now, if you would like to have a go at painting projects like this, then please take a look at my Patreon site, a little bit like a watercolor club, run and sort of organized by me. And the key part, or the main focus of that, are monthly painting projects where I set a painting subject based on a recent video or videos like this, and then you have a go at painting the same scene and submit it to me. Send a photograph of your painting to me, and in return I'll give you a critique, which may be a written critique, or it might be a short video that I create for you, so I can be a little bit more visual in my response back to you. So you get a critique in return based on these monthly projects, and there's a whole load of other things going on. There are lots of other activities to participate in, and we have an image sharing service as well. So if you're stuck for any painting inspiration, check that out. So it's patreon.com/Tim Wilmot, TIMWILMOT. More information in the comments of this, the description of this video. A little link for you to click on. Now, those distant cliffs, I just dropped in a bit of clear water. So I'm trying to get a very soft top edge to these cliffs where there's some low clouds, some sea mist coming in the distance. And then with a slightly thicker, so more paint here to water ratio, quite light as well, just dropping in very gently, and then a little bit darker towards the base, though that the far cliff and the shoreline going out into the sea. Now I'm mixing a darker colour for the cliffs on the left hand side, where I'm adding in a darker value to create that the depth of the cliff, and those parts of the cliff that are sticking out and there's a little bit of side shadow to them. Again, having a flat edge brush, nice and soft, creates some nice marks. A bit of a slope going downwards along the cliffs. So these horizontal lines, they're not these horizontal strata. They're not strictly speaking horizontal. They are at a slight angle. If I was standing face onto the cliff, there would be a bit of an angle there to it. So I'm trying to introduce that a little bit with these marks, and later on I'll go in with a few more detailed lines, slightly darker, just to emphasize some of those cracks and gaps in the rock. Alizarin crimson, that Windsor red. I just picked up a bit of clear water there to go a tiny bit softer towards the base. And then down towards the bottom of the cliff, where there's a few recesses to the cliff and a bit more of a shade occurring in there. This part here is the cliff faces a little bit more vertical. So it's a really interesting cliff face. Something similar I painted recently was the Capitol Reef Park in Utah with the red butte rocks, the castle rock there. So that's sort of fairly similar to what I'm doing here, that rich red colour and the different rock formations, the vertical cracks and the horizontal layers. Now this is the beach, so fairly light in value. It's lighter than the cliff face. I just painted around the front of that far boat. I'm constantly looking at my reference photo here for guidance, if you like, on the next step or extra detail on the cliff face. So keep looking at the photograph, then back to the painting, add another mark and adjust things as I go along. And gradually it's starting to give the appearance of a bit more of a depth to it and texture to that cliff face. Now those marks there, they're almost with a dry brush. There's not too much water on the brush, and just a light touch of the paper introduces a softer mark. Just dry it a little bit along the base there before I add in some darker marks. As well as the Patreon Club, I do run now and again some online live watercolor workshops, and they're announced on my website, timwilmot.com, and also you can see all of the up-and-coming events, and you can still take part and watch replays and get a critique of previous workshops I've done. So they're all recorded and available, different projects, different types of different subjects, landscapes, seascapes, street scenes, a whole load of them to choose from if you fancy having a go. So those are my online workshops, which I run on a fairly regular basis, sometimes once a month. But if you go to crowdcast.io/Tim Wilmot, you'll be able to see any up and coming. You'll get to hear about any up and coming workshops, and then take part in previous ones as well. You'll see all the previous demos I've done. So that's crowdcast.io/Tim Wilmot. I'm painting the shadow now with this is the overhang of the vegetation. And there's some form of buildings or structures right high up there on the cliff tops. Tiny bit of fencing maybe. I'm dragging my brush from the top downwards, and that will introduce a few more different variations in brush marks. Got to be careful not to go too dark in the distance. If I think it's going a little bit too dark, I can always lift it off. Sometimes I use my fingertips or a paper towel just to lift it off if it's gone a little bit too dark. As I said, down towards the bottom of the cliffs, that there are some darker recesses at the base, and I'm going to be painting those in now as I go along the cliff again. Quite a dark area there. And this just helps to, this darker colour just helps to define a little bit of the top of that slipway, but also just telling us again, it's just re-emphasising where the shore, the the top of the back of the shoreline starts, and creating those little recesses, I say, little gaps, tiny little, I don't think they're caves as such, they're not that big, but just areas where part of the cliff has come out and there's darker rock or some shadow being created behind it. Now, a synthetic round brush, this synthetic round brush I'm using for more of the smaller cracks, darker cracks, so quite the actual water to paint ratio now, I've got a bit more paint than water. It's a bit thicker in consistency. There I am, using my fingertips just to smudge it a little bit. Not to overdo it, but just to try and move the paint that's still a little bit damp further down those cliffs. Right at the bottom of some of these cliffs, you've got an accumulation of debris, and I guess this rock face is being eroded. It must get quite a bit of battering, especially in the winter. So little bits of rock are chipping off over time and dropping down to the base of the cliffs, and then creating these little protrusions into the sea of bits of rock and different debris coming off the cliff. Need to be careful with the details on the rock, not to overdo it too much. The more it's like looking at a building. The more you look at a building, the more architectural details you spot, and you think, well, shall I include that ledge or this this window or that doorway? And it's the same with this cliff face. It's rather like the facade of a building, and trying to. I paint. I would consider myself as a loose painter, slightly impressionistic, but I'm just trying to create the impression of this cliff face without going into too much detail. They're quite angular. Some of the parts of the cliff face, quite sort of abstract in shape. Mixture of soft edges and hard edges. So there has to come a time when you when you come to decision yourself that you've painting something like this, that you've put enough detail in, you've described it, you've given the impression of that rock face, and then the more you just get a feeling for the more details you put in, they're not actually bringing anything extra to the party. They're not actually contributing too much or so much as the initial marks you make. So you have to then stop, else you might, the danger might be it begins to look a little bit overworked. And I suppose the focal point of my painting might either be the figure or the fronts of those boats being in the sort of middle portion of the scene. That's my plan anyway. Now, after the cliffs, I'm going to paint these boats, and I start off with the hulls, leaving a little bit of light for the top of the boats where the light's catching little bits and pieces on top of the boat. I don't want to make the top of the boat too perfect. There's lots of imperfections and little bits and pieces along the top of the gunnels of the boat for where the oars will be, and bits of objects inside the boat as well, protruding up above the top. I'll keep these boats fairly similar in value and quite light at the top, but then come darker down towards the bottom of the boat. So this is why I painted around these boats at the first wash stage, just going around the edges of the boat, so I can keep them. Well, it keeps my options open. I can go either really dark or really light. I can have it lighter than the background. I'm adding in the shadows, darker, thicker colour, touching the bottom of the boat, so now against gravity that thicker colour is going up into the boat itself and giving me a gentle transition, a gentle edge, if you like, the difference between the actual boat colour and the shadow. And tiny bit of shadow at the back. And now along the top of the boat, just a few of those little things I was mentioning. I'm almost using my brush now. This is a small round synthetic brush with a fairly good point, just to create a few random marks. And while I've got this, I can't resist the temptation to add in just a few more little dots and dashes and lines on that cliff. Mixed up some really dark, a dark colour there. This is the figure going in now with that same brush. And this figure is fairly close to ready. I can't really decide whether it's going to be leaning against the railing. But anyway, very brief description of those legs and a shadow called sun coming from the right, shadow going to the left, quite a thin shadow, not too thick. A little bit of a kink in it. And then when I've got this colour, I can create some detail of the blocks of concrete or whatever going along the face of the slipway. Some verticals, just a few dots. Darker bit on the right hand side where there might be a little bit of a shadow. A few dots for the pebbles on the beach. Now, anybody that's been to Sidmouth, you might know that the end of the beach here, there's quite a few boats. Where the foreground is, there's quite a few boats there as well. And it's where some quite large trawlers come onto the shore. They're sort of winched back up the shore, I believe. But there's quite a few boats down there. So I'm painting in a few little ropes that could be tethering, securing those. It's one of these cliff faces that I just can't leave alone. I'm fascinated by all of the little marks that I keep seeing. And with that, I think I can get away with it with a small brush, not adding in any more significant darker marks. Some more details on the boats. I've got an even smaller round brush now. And pick up what I've just to the right of the lavender, I've got some dried up white gouache paint from a previous painting, and I just picked up a bit of that to try and get in the sort of base colour for the metal railings going down that side of the slipway, and I'll add a bit of shadow behind those. use my fingertips to pick up a little bit of colour from that figure. A few more details yet again on that cliff. And there's not a lot of paint. This small brush now has not a lot of paint on this, so the lines are quite faint. Again, if I've gone a little bit too dark somewhere, quickly lift it off with a fingertip or just gently smudge it. Little tiny white bits there on the slip. I put a tiny bit of colour behind those just to give a bit of shadow. A few more ropes going across down to the beach. Maybe a line going down in front of those boats. Some more detail on that back boat, and then a similar sort of dry brush mark on the near boat here. A long and gentle curve up to the back, like that. Should be okay. Perhaps a tiny bit of shadow underneath the top sort of rim, the top edge of the boat. Some vertical darker marks on the railings, and then just underneath the tops of the railings. I will go in later with a bit of white paint to pick up a bit of highlights on the top of the railing and the figure and other ropes. But while I've got this darker colour, create just a few of those extra details. I think this little block here needs a bit of darker value on it to give a bit more of a interest and a variation to some of the colours of these blocks facing us. Yes, I think that looks a little bit better. Slightly darker colour behind the slipway for a bit of that shoreline up to the figure, down the other side. And then continuing on down the right hand side of the boats. Right, final bit of drying with the hairdryer before I add in the white paint. I need to make sure everything's dry, otherwise if I go in with the white paint, because I'll be taking that fresh from the tube, it might just contaminate the white paint a bit and not be so bright as it could be. So I'm just making sure everything's dry here. Over the any area where I think I might dab a little bit of white paint. With a small brush then, and a good point, just pick up on some of those, the top edge of the railing and the right hand side facing the sun, and then the hat of this figure. I'll give them a bit of a, like a sort of, what would you call it, like a fedora or Panama type hat. A few tiny bits of highlighting on the rope, top of the rope, particularly where there's a bit of a darker background behind it, and that rope there. These foreground ropes. There are just a few little slithers of light at the very top of the cliff on the vegetation that's just catching a bit more light. So again, I'm using the white paint just for that. This is my completed painting, the red rocks, as I call them, of Sidmouth in Devon, UK. But these very richly coloured mudstone cliffs here, Very interesting feature with the horizontal cracks and vertical cracks in that cliff face. And then the receding values, we're going quite lighter with those values, introducing some soft edges in the sky as well, where the cliff top is meeting some low cloud coming in. So a mixture of different edges, different layers, transparent layers, which watercolor is very good at doing. So I started with the initial wash, painting over the whole scene, doing a bit of negative painting around the boats that I wanted to paint at a later stage. And then when everything's dry, going in with another transparent layer to bring in some feeling of the depth and form of the cliff face. And then finally, you saw me dabble with a small brush many times, trying to just pick up on tiny cracks and extra details and some darks, well, particularly along the base of those cliffs there, to create the impression, the form of those cliffs. Then I added in the boats and the figure to add some sense of scale and interest. I mean, a lot of people ask me what's the focal point of the painting. Maybe it could be the figure. I also thought maybe the front of the boat as well. You see that, and then you look at these cliffs, and then your eye travels down the length of those cliffs. But a wide range of watercolor techniques, trying to get that feeling of the recession of these cliffs into the distance and those soft edges. Hope you liked it. Catch up with you on the next video.